All right. Welcome to Gay Men Going Deeper, a podcast series by the Gay Men's Brotherhood, where we talk about all things personal development, sexuality, and mental health. Today, I'm your host, Calan Breckon, and I have a very special guest, Addison Brasil, with me. We're going to be discussing grief in today's episode, and I'm really excited to jump into it and learn more about this topic with all of you as Addison shares his story with us. Adam Brasil is a writer, speaker, conscious brand builder, and producer. Addison's work as a mental health advocate and grief lived experience expert brought him to the realization that as he entered his 20s, he was at one of the statistically most dangerous intersections of mental health, that being a member of the LGBTQ community, as well as identifying as male. And that was without knowing in the next 10 years, he would lose his brother to cancer, find his father from suicide, and survive a fatal event that killed a dear friend and left him needing to relearn how to walk and deal with a brain injury. After 13 years in a grief arena, Addison has shown back up with his new book, First Year of Grief Club, A Gift from a Friend Who Gets It, now a bestseller on Amazon. So, welcome to the show, Addison. I'm so glad that we could have you. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. I mean, I feel like with that intro, like I can just, sit back and, the work is done.
Yeah, right? The work is never done. If I've learned anything doing this podcast, the work is never done.
If anybody was hoping to hear different when it comes to grief, they can just exit now.
Right. I saw what was this, like a meme, I guess it's a meme, and it was showing this thing about grief, and it had this ball inside of this bottle, and it was like the grief never gets smaller. The bottle
Mm,
just kind of grew around the grief. And I think that that was like a beautiful kind of like understanding of like it's never going to quite go away. It's always going to be there. You just build more of yourself around it so that it doesn't take up that major part of you.
yeah.
So in saying that, tell us more about you and your story. And this kind of, we're talking about grappling with grief today, so just kind of lead us through your story. When did it kind of start and how did that all take off?
Yeah, no, of course. So yeah, I mean, you hit the main points there, so I'm sure that creates a natural interest for people. The truth is, I never intended to have anything to do with mental health or grief or, to be honest, I always thought that I would, when I moved to LA, I moved there to be in film, and as a writer and an actor, I thought, my life was always going to be too boring to not just do fiction, to not, have to make up stories that really connected people. But I was always really driven by, just being a kid and just being in a movie theater. And there's just those moments when something's happening on the screen, and no matter how misunderstood you may feel, you just have that like breath where you're like, oh, someone gets me. And that feeling is just what drove everything I ever decided to do, whether it was, dancing at the highest level, writing, acting, even like some of the impact work. It's always, if you kind of look at it, it's just always very story driven. I've just always been driven by story and reacting to it. But as it happened in the midst of sort of getting to live this amazing life that I've gone to live, my brother did get diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor in high school, which immediately shifted my entire reality. I mean, it just brought the idea of grief even being a potential thing to come into my world. And there's something about that out of order. He was my younger brother and he had a terminal illness. And so there was so much during what you can imagine is where you're finding yourself anyways during high school. So much of my high school experience was colored by that. And he did pass away when I was 19. So I actually went to school for my first year. And at the end of my first year, I did lose my brother to the brain tumor. And from that, at the age I was at and just sort of like where I was at, I really jumped into doing, into perfectionism, into overachieving, into, I really sort of attacked the grief in that way. I was on scholarship at the time, dancing 14 hours a day at school. I went back to school within 3 weeks. I started a nonprofit organization with and for my brother that would continue on after he passed. And I was like, very, very passionate about that. I look back and I was this 19-year-old bringing together all these people and having these events and doing this stuff. And I'm just like, why did anyone listen to me? I was like how did that happen, but it was just at the time so obviously my response to what was going on. That was just what I was going to do. And I don't really remember thinking two ways about it. So that kind of in its own way became its own vice, overachieving and whatnot. So I got to go off and, still live my dreams. And the weight of that was very difficult, especially at breaking points, this idea that my brother also had dreams and, wanted to be a stand-up comedian and do all these things. And then I was sort of getting to literally live mine out, for the years after. But
like the
about
survivor's guilt.
yeah. And again, just I don't know, just so weirdly specific and unique to the relationship. My brother was like so loving and so outgoing and so not afraid to walk into any room and just connect with people and make himself known and make jokes, even if they were bad ones. He had an energy that I definitely didn't have. And I think there was a sense of guilt around like I wasn't even like sort of that front facing and forward of like he was ready to take on the world kind of thing, and I was retracting. And I think that's where a lot of my guilt came from. And so I leaned, like I said, heavily on like achieving and like, look at this paper, look at this organization, like look that I'm
Proving
doing,
your worth.
yeah. So I think that was definitely my first vice, which considering I was in, university or college at the time, not a bad vice, I guess. Could have been worse, off of the way I was feeling from all of that. But yeah, so I finished school and I went off to start dancing professionally, and I fell a lot more into like the choreography side and directing. And I always had this pull from very young whether or not I would follow more of like the acting and writing route or dance. And it came down to how long my physical body was going to support one or the other. And so obviously it made sense to, do the thing while I could do it. But I came home in the midst of that about 4 years after my brother passed. And my dad had recently gone through a divorce, and we had been slightly estranged. Our grief processes didn't exactly align, which I used to feel weird kind of saying, but I'm getting more comfortable with that because it's just, very human. And I got to a point where I was working in Florida and I was doing my first job, and the things he was saying to me and the things he was sharing with me about how I should live my life, just I could see that there was no way to thrive through the grief and sort of what I was drowning in if I was taking this advice. So we had sort of stepped away from each other, and then I came back to Toronto, and he had recently got a divorce, a second divorce, and we reconnected and we got extremely close. And just my dad learned how to text, which meant my phone went off like every 10 seconds with these like cryptic like little messages and whatnot. And we finally had the relationship that I kind of like had always been longing for, which was like just really nice. Unfortunately, this was 10 years ago, and although I had concerns about sort of the changes that had been made in his life and sort of certain things, mental health wasn't being talked about the way it is now. We weren't
No.
trained to see signs of anything. It was just kind of, especially in like a Portuguese Catholic family and the patriarch. I mean, it just like we weren't by any means like a stoic, macho type family, like at all. Like we were very encouraged to be emotionally intelligent and to express ourselves. But that doesn't forego the lack of education that my father like would have had around mental health point blank, especially being a man, you know, 10 and 20 years ago. And yeah, my dad, he was suffering silently from what I understand with depression. And by the time I kind of clued into it, it was towards the end. And I'm going to skip because I don't know how to tell the story without it being 4 hours long. But I found my father after his suicide in July of 2012. And obviously in that moment, my entire life changed. It was literally the visual of everything that's never supposed to happen happening. And for the next 4 to 6 years to present day, my brain would have to work at making sense of what I saw, the relationship that I was grieving, just like the loving relationship without suicide or any of that being a part of it. And I'm sure we'll put a trigger warning in the description for this episode. Unfortunately, that's something that just kind of comes with me. Um, but um, but yeah, so that was the first time where words like PTSD and compounded grief, and that was the first time where it's, it started to compound. And in retrospect, my brother had this sort of beautiful death. I mean, we knew what was happening, we knew it was coming, of course, and only in comparison in retrospect, but we were all able to surround him, for his final moments. Literally, we were all in the room with him, this beautiful death. And then, 4 years later, I'm having this experience of like being completely shocked by sort of the most horrific thing I've ever been through. And it would be so long of having to deal with the trauma of it and the situation of it before I got access as just a son to losing my dad. There was so much that was going to have to happen in a mental health avenue when it came to the PTSD and the flashbacks and everything that I was going through. Um, but so I went out into the world. I got my extraordinary artist visa. I moved to LA. I kind of, see a pattern here. I went and kind of decided to go and try to fix it all and, build a new life and and do whatever I could mental health wise to, fix what was going on with me, which was just, a lot of flashbacks and just these kind of really highs and lows of when the grief would hit and when I couldn't get around it or what couldn't put away, and it just sort of kept getting bigger. It felt like, and it was supposed to be going away. It was supposed to be something I could fix, because otherwise, how could all these other human beings be walking around? We've all lost people. It didn't make sense to me. It must be something that we get over and we move through. And I think in a lot of ways, I thought that I did fix it in those 4 to 5 years. I did a lot, and I definitely got out of constant fight or flight. And I think to me that I was confusing that with my grief. I thought, we're good now. We're not constantly worried that I'm going to have like a flashback or, these sort of, I'd have these PTSD sort of reactions every time I would try to process the image of my father when he died, and that it was my actual father who I knew and loved and like as a human. Every time my brain would try to sort of put those two images together, I'd actually have like a physical like little reaction. I forget what the scientific name for it was, but it was literally like my body rejecting, no, not that idea, and it would sort of shut everything down. And so that's very hard to do when obviously you're going to think about that so often, where every time. And then obviously this is when Netflix starts to build and just like nonstop conscious consumption, except it wasn't that conscious. And, you're seeing these triggers all the time. And I'm just, I had such great support system around me during all of that, and which is the most magical part. But, just constantly getting texts of like Mad Men episode this, don't watch this, don't watch, because they knew like that it really could shift an entire week to a month for me if I was triggered and I wasn't ready. And this is kind of before I had a real sense of grounding tools or any kind of mindset training around what I was dealing with. But needless to say, I did kind of get to this balance, and I was in LA at the time and young and having fun, and it just all seemed like it was going to be great and we could put it all away. And, where's my Oscar? Because obviously that's what happens next, right? So that like sort of moment of bad stuff happens, and then, what happens next. And things were good. And for the first time in 2018, people were just like, wow, I didn't think I'd ever really talk to you again. Like, I didn't think I'd hear your voice like this. Like, you've really come through something. And I was celebrating that big time. In fact, I went out to celebrate with a friend. We went to a concert, and then we decided to go out dancing after. And on the way home, we got into a very bad accident that killed my dear friend. It was actually the anniversary on the 15th. So yeah, yesterday or the day before. So sorry if it's a little fresh at the moment. But yeah, we got in this accident. I was knocked out and then woke up, and my friend didn't make it, and I then was hospitalized, and it was months of relearning to walk and dealing with a brain injury, and just like the most intense concussive syndrome. I mean, I couldn't even, like, it was like light sensitivity, hearing anything. Like I was basically lying in a bed and staying like in the dark or, with covers on for a long time. And this was right at the point where I thought, it goes up from here, right? And it was the biggest and hardest challenge that I would ever face, because it came with this this physical aspect. I had always been able to move. I was like avid Barry's boot camp, shameless plug. Like, like I always moved to get through things, and then I couldn't move. Literally, I had to sit in all of it, and the pain just became so much. And there was a whole new element of PTSD that came with it, and it just was the most challenging point of my life. And it got to a point where I entered a suicidal depression, and I had to enlist everyone and everything available to me to try to make sure that I was still there for my family on the other side of it. And I kind of just had this moment where I had nothing left to lose. So I looked up and was like, hey, if you get me through this, I'll go back for the others, but you got to get me through this. And I remember, much like the moment when I started the organization, or anything else I've been involved in, like I really meant it. It was a deal, and I did come through it, and I kind of, for the first time, with this mixture of the mindset training I was doing with my coach at the time, and then finally getting the appropriate care as far as physical therapy and whatnot, I end up sort of 6 months after that moment, in the midst of building a mental health startup, fully out of pain, back to running, back to all the things they said I would never be able to do without pain, and sort of living and breathing and taking chances on love and being in the world again, which, like, just for anybody who's ever been in a true, suicidal depression or that close, I mean, it's just like, in my mind, it's almost like there's a glitch. And the only way I can describe is sort of, a lot of effort on the community that I had around me, a lot of effort from myself, but then like magic. It's kind of like when people describe their big break in Hollywood, there's got to be that element of pure luck, that it just didn't line up at the darkest moment in that moment. Like, I just kind of got this, there was always this little bit of magic from day one, that there's always this thing that I can't describe, where yeah, it kind of gets really dark there and I kind of fade out, but then I wake up again and I have this, this chance to kind of go on. So that's kind of the story of the grief. And what I always like to say is that, now take like a big like container of like laughter, love, hope, like getting to go all the way through the groundlings in LA and living my dream and being deeply connected with family and friends and everything, and like pour that on and let it, like, sit in between all of what I just said. Because I think what I'm realizing as I like do this book tour and I talk about it more and more is like, what's actually wild about my story isn't those 3 plot points and that I was sort of just to the left of death and experiencing them. What's wild is that, I always did still laugh. I always did still hope. I always did still show up. And that drove me. And that's such a reflection of the people that were around me, that like I just, deeply connecting was stronger than fully disconnecting at any of those moments. And that's the magic. That's what it was. I'm smiling because I've never said that properly before. So I'm like, wow, that's the magic. Cool. So I'm just letting that sit in.
Yeah. Yeah. You've had the full spectrum of human emotions, like multiple times. So there's a lot, which is why today we are talking about grappling with grief, because you are very familiar with it. So I want to trace back to something that you actually hadn't really brought up yet, was, you self-identify as somebody in the LGBTQ community. And how did that play in to these subtleties throughout this grief period, or throughout these, points in your life? Because I know that a lot of people out there, how do I say this? There can be grief associated with sexual orientation, because you're grieving the idea of the life that you thought you were supposed to have, or this idea that like you're never going to have this, or you're never going to be this for other people in your life. So how did that play into your story as you went through these experiences?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm really lucky, and the way that we were brought up, I've written an essay on this before, but like I always say, like at our table, like especially with the way my mom brought us up, and we just ate dinner at our table. No matter who you brought to dinner, we just ate dinner. Bring a boy to dinner, we eat dinner. Bring a girl to dinner, eat dinner. You bring somebody, It didn't matter. We just ate dinner. The only question my mom ever had growing up was whether or not they could still pass the mashed potatoes. So I got to grow up in this really loving, liberal, experience of just what could be. And I think, my siblings and I, we always had this sense of like openness and fluidity, but at the time, of course, we didn't really talk about it. And I had the beautiful experience of sort of fitting in with my fluidity into the norm as well. Like I had um, high school girlfriends that I like truly loved and like, truly was very physically attracted to. And we had these deeply connected relationships and, had all like sort of the like straight boy problems of like getting in trouble with my mom for, like it was just like the whole thing. So like I always had that openness and I had like a sort of a different experience of always drowning in acceptance because I knew there was more, which like sounds so privileged to say drowning in acceptance. But when someone says to you, you can be whoever you want to be, and there's so much to you, there's also sort of like, it's almost like suffocating because I had this fluidity. I think I secretly wanted them to tell me to get in the box and stay in the box. And, because I could have done it and it could have been easier. And, there was always just this other side of me that everybody was like, love who you love, but you're always welcome to kind of explore that openly or privately, or, that's there. I think it's important to say too, for anyone listening that, through my mental health advocacy work, I'm obsessed with the Trevor Project. I've done a lot of work in men's mental health, did a whole startup there. I'm actually like gonna go after Trevor's project.
Well, my friend works at Trevor's
You have to
project,
let
so
me get involved like in a bigger way because there's just so much that keeps me up at night around that. But the statistics do say that like someone who's an LGBTQ youth is 4 times more likely to die by suicide. And then I know from all my work in men's mental health that 3 out of 4 suicides are men. And men, I think it's 80% of suicides are men. So before I told you any of that story, if I had just been standing there as the Addison that was in 2008, as a late teen going into becoming a man, I was at a very dangerous intersection when it comes to mental health, just by being,
who you
just
were.
by being who I was in society and who I was trying to be and the societal norms that come down with that. And I think that's not said a lot, like before any experience, but whether you accept it or not, whether you were outed or not, before anything like that, we're sitting at just such a scary intersection. Like every gay man who listens to this would have been at that intersection, of suicidality. So it's only in retrospect and like as I write my memoir that I'm like, whoa, like so imagine finding that out and then the story begins. That's where you're sitting. So it is kind of like the enemy of the story. I don't have like one person that was always trying to keep me down, throughout this. The enemy of the story is just literally mental health and resilience, or a lack of resilience, like whether or not I will be able to overcome those odds that were sitting there before one death, before compounded death, before PTSD. So it's very interesting, but like I do find that grief, like you're saying, it does go hand in hand. There's so much about having to honor just what is with grief, and I think that goes hand in hand with sexuality. And I think that they can also, which is something people don't talk about a lot, and I think it's important to say on a gay man's podcast, is they can also become intertwined, and it can become complicated and destructive in the way that sexuality gets involved in your grieving, and how you're sort of trying to disconnect emotionally, so maybe you're connecting more sexually, or whatever the mix is. It's also interesting to me, and I openly say this, that I couldn't seem to not kind of be interested in the next woman in my life when I was younger. And then I lose my brother and I lose my father, and I know I have this fluidity within me, and I know that I have that side of me, and suddenly male attention is so important to me. Male intention and male dynamics where I can be involved but maintain my power, where no one can hurt me. But like, so you can get a therapist involved. I've paid the thousands of dollars, but I mean, just from saying that out loud, I think a normal person can start to put together how intertwined everything we do and sort of these grief processes can be. It is brain science, but it's not brain science. It's like, well, this happened and now I need and want this so badly,
Yeah.
in my life. And that's one thing that sort of I was looking back. Of course, I didn't know in the moment, but I was this master of vices. I was kind of too smart to be dumb in a way. Like I'd overachieve just enough, and then I'd drink just enough, and then I'd use casual sex or whatever it was, all these things just enough to kind of create this balance where I was never having to be head on with my trauma and my grief. But I was doing it masterfully because, by the time you'd catch on to it, what are you going to do? Walk up to me at a charity event and be like, I think that I'm running, and say, I think you're losing it, or, I think you need help. And it's like, so it was confusing for me, like, because I was like, but I'm still able to do all this, so I must be fine. And
Yeah.
this all must be normal. And as much as it is normal to go through that, what's not normal is how much you're doing to not honor what's going on. And so I think anyone, I don't have to, become a third grade teacher here. I think anyone listening, especially this podcast, sees the parallel in how, grief lives within you. And it's something that will eventually have to be very truthful for you to feel authentic and like you belong again, and not isolated by just the experience of being yourself.
Mhm.
It's so, yeah, add the layers of that feeling normally. And I will say, like, we did have that beautiful table where everybody could come, at growing up, but everyone else's table was not like that. And I
Yes.
definitely, 14 years ago, walked out in the world and was like, if I have a choice in this, or like, if I'm going to sit at these other tables, it's not the way it was, it is now, and that's obviously for, we all know, but for the younger listeners, like I love it. I think it's amazing now that how celebrated gay men are in business and arts and entertainment. And, you have things like the Out 100, and like, it's, to be honest right now, like, the diversity part of it is a plus, which is like incredible. Like, that's just not something that seemed like it was going to happen outside of my house, at our dinner table in
Yeah.
the world, and even in Canada, obviously more so in the States when I moved there. But yeah, it just wasn't something that you thought was going to happen. So I think for me, the difference was not so much of like I have this thing that I'm hiding and it needs to come out, as within my fluidity and my grief, I was constantly lost. Like, who am I? I just need to know who I am so that I can support myself, so I can show up for myself, so I can give myself every fighting chance to be here against these odds,
Mhm.
And it was just a true confusion. And I guess in retrospect, it wasn't a confusion. It's like, you can't define a human being.
Yeah.
That's like, I was trying to just be like, tell me exactly who you are, Addison, so I can fix this. And
Yeah.
it just, and I really thought that I could do that. And obviously the takeaway of my life, and so far, I'm not trying to have any bookends here, a lot of living to do, but is that, grief and mental health are not something that you fix. They're something you honor. And that's what ended up going on the back of
Yeah.
the book, because I just wanted to make sure, even if you bought the book and it just sits on your table, that you're constantly reminded that this is not something you fix. And I think, as you said, the parallel for sexuality, I mean, so many people go down that pathway of, I can fix this, I can fit in, I can, whatever it's like, I don't even want to give energy to the limited beliefs, because I just feel like we're going the right way,
Yeah.
So it's like, but I think we all know them intimately, and with a few deep breaths, what comes up in that way. And so in a lot of ways, I can see how, you just made me see very clearly how this book could also benefit anyone who's sort of grieving the loss of themselves, of what they've always known, of what they've always, put out
Yeah.
there and showed up as.
Oh, yeah. And that also comes in the form of, I know I've worked with many people who are going through the coming out process, and there's a grieving for the person you thought you were, or the person you thought you were supposed to be. And now moving into this exciting part of your life where you get to honor those feelings, you get to honor that authenticity of yourself. And there is grief that comes along with that, because there may or may not be people who continue to be in your life because of that, because of you being your authentic self. And so it plays out in many, many different ways. And all the things you just said were so beautiful. And just shout out to therapy, because therapy is amazing. And that
Therapy
there's,
and coaching, and find your people that work for you. If it's
yes,
not working, it's like a relationship, it has to be, because I think there's a danger to that blanket, because then you show up and it's like, if I'm not fixed in these sessions, then it is a working relationship, and you do have to also state what you intend to get out of it. And one thing that I would say is, make sure that the treatment, the plan, is forward motion based. At the end
yes,
of sessions, we're going to have actual tools that we're going to use based on what was said, to shift mindset, to,
yeah,
my that's the coolest part of my story, is that on the cusp of dealing with my dad's estate right before the accident, I put my hands up in the air. It's like I've talked to God 3 times, the time that I said I would go back for the others, and then this time where I said I needed help, and then one very, very angry conversation after my dad passed. But I just said I needed help, and I got on a plane the next day, and the person sitting next to me is who has been my mentor and my excellence coach, Jennifer Merrifield. She's from Toronto. Total chance meeting, and it was like I asked for help. I got on the plane to deal with the worst thing I was dealing with at the time, and she was sitting beside me, and it was like this 5 hours. And that, I do have to say, like, I've had a mental health mixtape that involves everything, from like healing techniques to therapy to coaching, but getting that mindset training, getting that full rewiring of how I operate in the world. I was not built to overcome or even deal with these losses. I was not. I was built to go right into a victim mode, and it would have ended the way it almost did, if I hadn't had this whole team. And there's just so much to the way we're approaching things, because unfortunately, like, these things do happen, especially when it comes to grief. We will all grieve this loss of something meaningful at some point. The pandemic has proved that, our normal lives have been taken from us, whether it's in a big way or a small way. Not that measuring serves us, but like, we're all going to deal with the loss of something meaningful, and it's sort of not built into our mindsets at an early age of how to do that, and
We're not
especially how
given
to
the
do
language.
it. Yeah, no,
We
the
don't grow
language.
up learning or knowing the language.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So um yeah, it's just it's such a mix, and you really find your mix, I think, is what I would say to people. And if you go to therapy and that specific experience doesn't do it for you, which again, it's not something that would be fixed in an hour. It's something that you're just honoring what's coming up, and someone's helping you to facilitate that. If it had been explained to me that way a lot earlier, I think that, my perspective going into it would be very different.
Yes.
What this is and what this isn't, because we think of a doctor like it's going to fix the problem and then we get to resume. And what we really need is a team of people that are going to help us achieve resilience by helping us honor everything we're taking with us.
and
Unfortunately, I just
and
drop people.
learning the language and learning how to move through that experience because of their experience with their expertise on it. And I just wrote down, when you're talking, like, for me, therapy is not fixing it. Therapy is learning how to feel it. And that's
Mhm.
like, it's learning the language of your feelings and your internal self, and like what that really truly is, because we don't grow up learning these things. At least my generation didn't grow up. In 35, I didn't grow up with these things and these ideas, and like, how to describe what I'm truly feeling, and how, I'm angry about something. It's like, well, are you truly angry about it, or are you upset about something? Like, what is the deeper meanings underneath at the surface level, emotions that you're feeling? And so for me, therapy is the language, learning the language of feelings and how to actually truly feel them. And not only that, but also how to process those things and how to move through those things in a forward motion to integrate that into your life moving forward. So it's been huge. And plus, therapists can just see things that you can't see because you got your blinders on, and they're just like, what about this over here? And you're like, oh yeah, I forgot about that, just thought I'd leave it over there.
Oh, absolutely. And even as somebody who did grow up, like I did have therapists growing up, like I said, I had that experience. You still learn very quickly that that's still not how the rest of the world is playing.
Yeah.
And so the same thing when I did the men's mental health work, I still learned outside of my house very quickly of what the world thought masculinity was. I still learned very quickly whether or not the things I was taught in therapy were going to work in like a business setting 15 years ago. Like, no, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like we're just getting there now. Like we're just seeing the big corporations really, with grief and mental health start to really make room for human beings to, work and be in these places of work and actually thrive. But yeah, so it is one of those things, because I hear that a lot, especially from other gay friends. It's like, if only I had just started therapy. And it's like, yeah, it's just like the world also wasn't ready. So, yes, I had it and you were there, but then you still were sort of living that double life of like, having. So it's so nice that I hope that it's really coming along. Just the fact that these conversations are happening obviously means that it is.
Oh,
It's
they are. And then we have people like Brene Brown out there who's like, just has so many years of research, and like, is, because I'm a very like analytical, very like methodical type person. I'm a big thinker. And so when she explains things and goes through things, she's always about the data and the science and, the research that she's done. And I appreciate that because it allows me to integrate it easier and understand it on a different level than if people just talked about the feelings or talked about the things. I need to understand, like, why is this leading to this, and where did this come from, and where is the proof that this is actually something that somebody's experiencing, or how somebody experiences it. So I really appreciate and love her work because it just constantly opens my eyes and my understandings of how the world works. I want to go back because we are talking about this, lack of education and language around grief. Was that a big component in you going through these experiences? Because you just said that you had the access to therapy and you had the access to that. So you grew up having more of that education and that language around your grief, or was it still very much a learning experience?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, nothing would have really prepared me for like in that sense. And I think because like childhood therapy is sort of the moment. I was the first person in the neighborhood to like have a divorce, going to a Catholic school, like in a small town, So I think it was always very driven by what was going on. And now obviously again, only in retrospect do I see like what a grief process, like, all these losses of what's meaningful. And, so it is there. No, I absolutely felt when I first really had to grapple with grief in a way that not only I was very aware of, but it was publicly aware. He lost his little brother. Hold to watch how this person like survives and moves in the world. Oh, now his father as well. Like it's, there's this, I was sort of an audience member too in that way of how does this work? How does this move forward? But I definitely felt when those things happened, just like all of a sudden I was dropped into a country where I didn't know the language. And not only did I not know the language from my internal dialogue, I didn't know how to speak to me presently. I didn't know how to speak to my inner child about what had happened. I didn't have any language around how to prepare other people for what I was going through. I just thought I was supposed to get over it and fix it and and hope that I don't mess things up and tarnish relationships by the time that happens, and I just felt like I was sort of playing in a casino all the time with all of these emotions and what was coming up for me. And, I didn't know when I would have an outburst of anger or a flashback or, whatever it was, where grief would just totally take me out. And I understand that that is your wedding or that is your big day or your special day, but I also just like cannot move. Today is the day where my body is physically showing me what I've lost. It feels like my ribs are being broken and my heart is literally being squeezed and I cannot move, but I wasn't saying any of that. I was just taking the hit and saying, I was sick, or letting them think I was just, not coming,
Right.
because there's also a part of it that you don't want to let anyone know that it's that bad and that it gets that bad.
Yeah,
Um,
because we don't want to be perceived as weak, especially as men in today's society. Weakness is the only thing as a man you are not supposed to be perceived as. So
right.
it's like, how do you then allow yourself to experience the humanness of those experiences of, not being weak, but feeling your emotions and allowing yourself to experience what you're told you're not supposed to experience. And then be like, okay, well, do I hide this? Do I not hide this? What are people going to think? And it's just like, you're just a human having the human experience, but how do you convey that to
Like
other
sort
people?
of like a Santa Claus complex because I was so young and I had so many close friends and family members that were all sort of the same age. There's just this idea of like, I don't know, subconsciously, I just didn't want them to know how bad it really was to be the brother or the son or to have seen what I'd seen or what I had gone through. I just like, eventually they're going to grieve and they're going to know. They're going to have the long nights. They're going to beg God for something that cannot happen. Like they're
Hmm.
going to go through these things. And so why tell them now? Why
Hmm.
look them in the eyes and tell them now? And which is so funny because we're saying like you're not prepared. But then I myself, when I first came up against it, the first thing I wanted to do was protect everyone around me from the reality of how difficult it really is to grieve.
Hmm.
Especially like, I mean, we're talking, everyone's like, oh, you wrote a book. And I'm like, 13 years later, 13 years in the grief arena, 13 years of experimenting, of getting to know myself, of finding language, of, communicating. And this is someone who's actively a part of their process. Like after the accident, my job was to stay alive for 2 years full time, so I was just in it fully. And then also, like when I went on to build a startup, it was a mental health startup. So my work depended on me understanding these things. And I still feel lost at points.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that it's hopeless in any way. It's just that it is an active process. And the sooner you can get to the point of accepting that this is something I wake up with every day and I build a relationship with every single day. And that's okay, because that's just how every morning starts, just like opening your eyes or brushing your teeth. I wake up, I kind of acknowledge my relationship with who I've lost and what I've lost. And I know very quickly how today is going to go and what I need to do to nurture where I am today in that grief process.
Mm-hmm.
There's days like this where, I only have a few minutes. And if I talk about my brother Austin, I know that I'm going to cry my eyes out, because today I am not an advocate. I am not an author. I'm a brother. And that is my baby brother. And I wish that never happened. And so there's times where I'm like, okay. So how do we honor this? Like, what do we bring in? What are we doing today to not push it down, but to live with it, to stand beside it, and to also kind of be courageous, like you said, in a very Brene Brown way, about letting the people around you know that
Mm-hmm.
that's where you're at, and these are your boundaries, and this is how you're moving forward for today. So we so badly want, especially with grief, to like make it like these permanent things. I'm better, or I'm good, I'm sad now for X amount of time, because then we feel like we can sort of like,
Down
plan.
and up and down.
Truth is, like, I have every year this happens with death anniversaries. The days leading up, it's like, oh no, oh no, oh no. And it's a crippling grief and anxiety and all the emotions that come with it. And then the day happens, and on the day I have the best day ever, because it's the lead up,
Yeah.
but I'm making all these arrangements. Yeah, I'm not going to work on that day, it's the anniversary, and I just don't know how I'm going to feel. So I'm, and then meanwhile, it's all the days leading up to that day that I didn't take off. And then on that day, I'm like, yeah, I can work.
Right.
Like, so
But that's
it's
the
very,
work that you've done to get to that place. That's you learning the tools, learning the language, learning how to move through and process that. And it's, honoring the experiences that you went through. And, by doing that, by doing the work in that regard, you then can have the strength and the power to prime other people on how you're going to possibly be, so then they can understand that experience. I recently had a girlfriend. Her mom passed away just before Christmas, and I've known her since like middle school. Like, we go way back, and she's one of my dearest friends. And I finally got to see her for the first time in Vancouver when I went home to see my mom, who had just been diagnosed with cancer, who had just like gone through surgery, and like I hadn't seen her in 4 years, and that's what my friend's mom had died from. And so, worlds had collided. And when I was with her, she's a very spiritual person, and she does the work. And we had this really beautiful conversation of like how, she has these new friends and these people. And one of these, she had an interaction with one of them, and then she then has to go and think about it and process it in order to then have the next conversation with this person and be like, look, I understand this is the experience you had with me, but I'm still deeply in grief and processing. And so I don't know how I'm going to show up. And I just need you as a friend of mine to know that in the back of your head, that I'm not always going to be there. I'm not always going to be on. I'm not always going to be available. And this is part of my process and part of my honoring my experience. But it takes so much consciousness or conscious effort and realizations and kind of like self-knowingness to be somebody who can express that. Because if this is something somebody's experiencing, especially around grief, we don't learn these things growing up. So it's taken her years and decades of, doing the spiritual work to get to a place where she has the tools and the knowledge to use that language. But most people are just running around, bumping into each other, getting pissed off and angry and upset because they're assuming the other person should know how their inner world is going. But people won't know that unless you honor yourself and then kind of prime them on how that experience is going to go. And life is just messy. Like, there
yeah.
is no
So like you're saying, like, even if you were taught everything, which I certainly was not in any way, like, I just was saying that I did get to go to therapy before the age of 18. That's all I was saying earlier. But even if you went to grief school instead of high school, that's kind of why I never claim to know anything about anybody else's grief processes, because it's also, no matter what, no matter how prepared you are, no matter, if you've sat with the monks and, you have all your modalities and your toolkit and you're ready for when life or the loss of life happens, you can have all those things in play. But it also comes down to the exact timing and the exact moment that that relationship ends in the physical form. Did you have a fight the day before? Where were you? Like, what, there's so many things that you will then have to kind of unpack as you go for years to come, when you're ready, in a delicate way, in a compassionate, kind, and curious way to yourself. There's all these things that it's totally different if my dad and I are on a boat having the best day ever and he has a heart attack than, finding him after suicide like I did. Yeah, either way, I'm dealing with the loss of my father, but like the grief process that results from that, it's almost as if I wouldn't even have been grieving the same person. The grief that surrounds their memory is completely different, right down to the timing. So, one of the hardest things to do is to let go of the idea of like being prepared for this in any way, but being willing when it does happen to really go along for the journey of it, and be, like I said in the book, I just keep reminding everyone, because it's all experiments in the book. It's just, weekly experiments that for some reason work for me along my journey, and I stay with them for a year, and it's from the level of a peer. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a grief counselor, I'm not looking into the arena, I'm in the arena with you. And it's just like if we were at the gym and you thought my arms looked good and you're like, hey, what do you do with your arms? It's like, just as a friend, I'm not taking on the liability of if you hurt yourself doing what I do, but here's what I would offer. And I just for so long froze anytime somebody was like, I've just lost somebody, or I've just lost something, or calling me and saying, oh, I have a friend who's just lost their parent. Would you talk to them? And I'm like, yes, I get it thematically that like it's similar and you think that I'm the person who should talk to them, but I can be also a very scary mirror of reality in the sense of everything that I know about a grief process. And, so it's much slower than that. And, I say to people, once the flowers and the condolences and the casseroles fade away and that silence hits, that's when I'll talk to them. And I literally wrote the book for that, to start when all the formal stuff, which we were, unfortunately didn't even have that part of it in COVID for a lot of people, which is grieving.
Which is usually the distraction part.
Exactly. So you're going right into the silence sometimes if that's limiting your ability to gather and to honor somebody. But yeah, that was the void, is because every time someone would ask me, I would freeze, and I just couldn't say like, sorry for your loss or my condolences. Like I couldn't say these things because I just felt like this fraud. It's like, everything and nothing. Like, why are you not showing up? And it was so much more complicated than that, to a point where now, it's a 200-page book of how delicately I would want to befriend somebody who's starting a grief journey. Or also, I get this question a lot lately, is whether or not if this has to find somebody as soon as they're first experiencing grief, because it's called First Year of Grief Club. But it can also be the first year that you decide to honor your grief and embark on experiments in doing so. And I say it again and again in the book, like, if this doesn't work for you, I'll be the first one to help you throw it out. Like, this isn't about me being an expert. This is about you finding what works for you. And I think when you go back to like what you're saying with a toolkit, we have this idea of like what a literal toolkit is, like a hammer, hammers nails into a wall. A screwdriver has to work with certain screws. But there's a lot of time in grief where you have to be willing to pick up whatever's around you to get the nail in the wall. You don't have a perfectly formed hammer for years. The perfect tool that's great for you and like, won't hurt you to use it and like won't damage the wall. Like, you don't have that hammer for a long time. But are you willing to pick up a dumbbell? Are you willing to pick up your shoe? Are you willing to get the nail in the wall? It's so much of the journey before it's ever this like sort of, oh, wow, okay, this is like, I'm at a point now, like I was saying, where it's like, oh, I'm waking up, I have to talk about grief today. This is how I'm feeling. I'm going to honor that. Okay, so I'm going to use this grounding technique and like, like Kori Mascara, like meditation. Like it's like I have all the things I'm going to do. Oh, it's a lot of energy sitting. I'm going to work out. Like I know the mix. And even knowing all that, there's some days where I just go, well, I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to sit and sort of let myself suffer. We have these moments where then the honoring is the fact that you didn't honor or help yourself, so it's just always be willing to, and you may find eventually, like going back to that metaphor, like that a hammer is not your tool of choice, even though it's everybody else's. But if you can still do the job and get it done, like it's about what your hammer is, It's very careful not to prescribe, these are the 10 things to get rid of grief, or these are the 10 things to honor grief. Even it's just everything has to constantly stay this experiment. It's in the piece of finding that you're always going to be in that phase of process and honoring. It's a lot like dance. There's never a check mark in dance. Never. Like you will never be the best ballerina of all time. Like it just because the next day, how you approach the movement and how you stretch it further stretches the potential of it. So grief is a lot like that, where there can almost be solace in just accepting that early, I think. Where I was convinced there was a way to fix it. There was a finite amount of grief. There was, this idea that this is something that I can do.
Yeah, I'm going to get to this point and it'll be fine. Like it'll just be the mark. I
Yeah,
want to go back a little bit to talk about because we talked a little bit about COVID and how people skipped that, support community aspect of it and just went straight into like the dark quietness. And I want to talk a little bit about like the importance of community and support, because that's a lot of the work we do with the Gay Men's Brotherhood and the podcast. We provide that safe community for people to be a part of if they've never belonged to a community before, or they're just looking to be part of a community. So how important is having that aspect in a process like this for somebody?
It is 100% the reason that I'm here. There's no doubt. Yeah, I mean, that's why I think you see this through line of every time I'm dealing with something that's impossible or isolating, I'm desperately trying to build community around it. And a lot of times my sleepless nights were, okay, there's someone somewhere with less privilege, with less access to help, with less of a support system, with less of a community that's going through what I'm going through. And that's going to be a really long night. And I couldn't even sleep thinking about that. Like, just like there's got to be so many people who feel exactly like I feel, who don't have my mother, who don't have my friends, who don't have the support system I have. And I know how challenging it is for me, even with all of that, So I think it's just so important. And the beautiful thing is that so many people now are so interested in building community and kind of creating spaces where people can go. And I think that was one of the gifts of COVID too, is you could find these digital communities where any sort of fears around showing up physically in a space, because it can be very intimidating, especially if it's driven by grappling with grief or sexuality or mental health. It's like as soon as you walk in that door, you feel this sort of label of why you've shown up, and the fear of
Everybody
just,
knows why.
oh, yeah,
Like you're
exactly.
here and you're here because we're all here.
Yeah.
So
And the fear of just going can sometimes completely deplete, getting the experience. And so it's been really cool to see. And I spent a lot of time in a lot of men's groups and facilitating a lot, and with my time in the startup, and just really seeing how important it is just for us all to learn from each other's experiences. Like it's just, there's nothing that just sort of validates that like everything that's happening to me is completely normal in a way than to hear someone that you feel like is telling your exact story and sharing your journal, but they're not. They're talking about their own life and their own experience, and it just shows like how universal it is. I've looked for every opportunity to build community around these things, and honestly, from a selfish gain at points, I just really didn't want to do this all alone, and I didn't want anybody else in a selfless way to do it alone either. I think it's just, when I said earlier, the magic, like those sort of blackouts and the magic kind of kept me alive. It's community that is 100% the magic. And it's if you're listening to this and this is in any way feeling isolating, or, like, well, I don't have a community, so, I'm doomed kind of feeling, like, or anything like that kind of thing. I want you to know, like, I was the shyest kid in the room growing up. And like, it is also a skill you cultivate. And the biggest part of it, yeah, is just showing up, and the
Yep.
community sort of begins to form around you, which is the really cool thing. Showing up authentically, it's like you're guaranteed, 2 or 3 people in the right spaces. I mean, you're not going to walk into, like, a bar at 2 a.m. and be like, let's get vulnerable. I
Let's
think
find my people. No.
that's not vulnerability, like, again, like Renee's examples, like, sharing your wax on Instagram, that's not like, that's not what we're talking about, but showing up in safe spaces that have been created for that purpose, like what you guys have created. um you know that there's so much safety to that, and so much builds off of that, and the friendships that come out of those safe spaces are just lifelong. And there's a deep connection that it's not this constant upkeep, because you both know what and
Hmm.
it's the beautiful thing. And I call it my grief club, the people who really just get it, and that's obviously lent itself to the titling the book, that we can all kind of be in this club and acknowledge it without it being something that we like constantly have to like physically gather around.
Yeah.
um
I always
yeah.
say that being in community has been one of the biggest healing experiences of my life, because I very much was like the shy one, the alone one. People like perceived me as one way, but internally myself, I was like anxieties. Like I don't want to, like it scared me to be vulnerable enough to be in community. And it was always the first step, because I
Mhm.
always just say you don't know what you don't know, and you're afraid of the experience because you've not had the experience yet. But once you've had the experience and you do that multiple times, well, then that becomes a habit, or that becomes a learned experience that you're like, oh, well, I can do this because I've done it before. Like going to dodgeball for the first time, it sounds silly, but gay dodgeball, the first time I joined, I knew I needed to make friends in the city because I just moved here. I didn't know anybody, but I had huge anxiety because I didn't know what to expect. But then I was met with a welcoming community, and then the more I went, the more I became at home in that community, because I learned through the experience of going. And you heal through so much through experience in community. And we build up these big stories in our heads, especially when we're not in community, about how you're going to be perceived, or the flashback fears of being perceived before and not wanting to experience that again. And like, so many more people in this world want to celebrate you and enjoy you as a person than want to tear you down. And you can't live your life in that one experience that you had. Um,
I think
we
too,
got,
for those introverts too, I just want to say that I found some of the greatest sense of community in places that you wouldn't expect. So like, again, always be willing to look at the definition of it, because for instance, like I find a great sense of community when I go to a movie theater to watch a movie. I go by myself. Everyone thinks it's weird, but I love going to the movies by myself. But I'm not by myself. I'm with everybody else who has chosen in that time, in that moment, to watch it in a public place. So there's these ways of going to a comedy show, even if you're alone, when you all laugh in unison, like as we're able to like safely rebuild these things, it's so important that we get back to that, because watching the same movie on Netflix as everybody else is not the same. There isn't a sense of community. There isn't that connection. So it's like where can you start to build, where you feel held and safe, and like you're a part of something, but maybe not so head on as to like, sitting down in a support group and sharing like on the
yeah,
first day, so, or like you said, like with sports leagues or whatever, there's so many like beautiful Trojan horses into how you kind of get into a conscious community. And I think, sometimes it's not just like the obvious, I have to do this. There are like, just think of where can I be where I'm having the same experience as others that I've chosen, so they've chosen. So, there's already that common ground where I can feel connected to other people. Seeing
mhm,
movies alone got me through like half of my grief process, because a lot of the time also, like, I just didn't want to interact, not because I was afraid of it at this point socially, but because it was just too much. But I needed to not be alone at the same time. So safe spaces where you can just have space, yoga, meditation, like where you're in a community of like-minded people, where it's not always about the social aspect or the talking either. You can feel held in that. I think there's so many different versions of what community are. And like, again, like grief, it can be this thing where you experiment and, how did
oh
I
yeah,
feel? Scared in a good way, like, it's usually scared in a good way. My whole improv training and career started off just being done with being too shy to open my mouth like my brother and my dad always could. If I could improv a whole show based off one word, then I think I could like go back out into the world and start conversations.
Right.
So
But
it's
it's the
just
lived experience of going through that and then building that muscle memory in your mind of having the experience that got you to that place. So it's, yeah, community is so insanely important. So we have a couple more minutes, and I just want to dive into one thing, because we've talked a lot about the lived experience of being the one who's in the grief. And I want to flip it and now talk a little bit about, people who aren't the ones going through the grief and maybe haven't even experienced that for themselves, or a deep grief, and who are on the outside looking at somebody who is experiencing that. And one of the things that I wrote down was just like how somebody can show up for that person. And I just wrote down this question. I can't remember what you were saying, but I wrote down this, how do you need me to show up for you today? Because if you're in that experience where, and this isn't like bending over backwards for everybody in your life kind of a thing. It's honoring the fact that somebody's gone through something and they continue to go through something at a certain, intervals. And it's just like, okay, I know that this has happened. How do you need me as your friend to show up for you today? And I think even just that kind of language and learning how to approach those things are so important. So what are some things that you know of, or that really helped you in that realm?
So one thing that I would say, especially for this podcast, is for anyone who feels like they're listening to this and they just don't, they don't connect with maybe what grief is. And I'm, like I said, if you went into what I call the micro grief processes, which is not a measurement of big or small, it's just that you have to take a microscope and realize, oh, I have lost things that were meaningful to me. And there's these mini grief processes that society is not, tuning into. One of my benefits was I had this very tangible grief process that, like, obviously people expected there to be a grief process to follow when they hear the news, right? A lot of us are doing this silently. A lot of us are doing this with our identity, right? So we never know also, like, without a death even, like how many people around us are grieving. But I would say many of us are very familiar with the idea or how it feels to be ghosted. That's something that comes up a lot, especially in this community. But it's the most personal ghosting of all time. It's just, and it's permanent. And it's the person sometimes that you would go to when you felt that way normally for support that has, and that's not what's been done. And I'm definitely not using this in correlation with suicide. I don't feel that way at all in a literal sense, but that feeling, which I can tell by the way you nodded and the way you smiled immediately, we all know that sort of, I feel like I don't matter because I was not consulted in my entire life shifting, and if we feel that way off of Tinder, imagine a lifetime of a relationship with someone or something that's so deeply meaningful, and then feeling that just immediate cutoff, and you're just expected to, that's what happened, so I when I explain it to people my age like that, they seem to click in a little bit differently, because everybody knows sort of that, like, you have to go through the process, even though you like know it's kind of silly sometimes, but like that feeling of like someone chose not to be here with me, it's like that's kind of what it feels like for a long time. As far as supporting somebody in grief, my go-to is asking, what does support look like for you in this moment? Don't try to be smarter, don't try to be overly helpful, don't try to figure it out. Let them be the expert of their experience. Ask them, what does support look like for you in this moment? Because it also empowers the person who's grieving. If nobody asks me that, then I never even know what I need either. And then we're just sort of in this tangle, and when people did ask me that, it's like I said earlier, 9 times out of 10, I want you to be here, but I don't want to talk. I want to not be alone, and I want to be held in a safe space. But I know that I will just go hyper and just talk and talk and talk and try to figure out verbally death, which is
Yeah.
just not healthy at a certain point, right? So just asking, what does support look like for you in this moment, I think is just the number one thing when you're supporting somebody. And I don't know, I think there's a lot of value in, like you said, we can't prepare for grief, but I think it is something we'll all deal with. So it's beneficial on both fronts. You're going to interact with somebody sooner or later that's dealing and grappling with grief as well. So I think there's something about becoming familiar with these grief processes and these grief books and resources that exist before you have to. I always say that, like, my whole drive for the men's mental health movement was based on my story, is to like encourage men to take this step before it's absolutely necessary, because it's so different when you're approaching therapy, well-being, anything, mental wellness for the first time from a place of survival.
Yeah.
If you can approach earlier. And I think it also just benefits in the way we support everyone around us and how they deal with their mental health and their grief. If we're not learning about it in sort of the red zone of the moment of it happening and needing to be there or to help or to support, So I think intellectually getting your mind around it, knowing that the visceral and the individual experience of it for yourself when it comes to you will always change, but just from a place of wanting to be able to be more supportive. I think that Megan Devine's book, It's Okay to Not Be Okay, is like a wonderful reference for people who are not grieving, for people who are supporting people who are grieving, because even for people sort of in the midst, that book was like, now I read it and I nod and I'm like, yeah, she gets it and she knows. But if I had tried to read that on day one or week 3 or 3 months in, it was like learning a concept from within, like it's just, it resonates differently at different times. So I either had to read it before or like, sort of later into my grief process, where it's like, okay, I get what she means because I've lived the life experience of it, um, so that's why also I wanted to show up kind of with something that was complementary. There's also a new book that I think you would love. It's called The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor. It's actually only on Audible. I think it comes out today on St. Patrick's Day. Mary, I don't know you, but here I am doing your promo on my book tour. But this book I did not know was coming out, and I've been listening to it, and it is basically like scientifically backing everything that I have sort of found from a peer perspective and tried to explain. So if you're like me, which you said earlier you are, where you need that sort of science part as well, my book and that book, I feel like, are just like such an amazing like companionship, because sometimes we're like, okay, but what's the science of what's happening with me, and I become such a nerd about that, and this book finally like goes into it specifically for grief. But I would definitely put that out. And also I just want to say, with my book, for anybody who does end up reading it, it really is meant to be a living, breathing thing. I wanted feedback. I want to know what works. I want to know what doesn't. I want to know if experiments resonated. I want there to be other editions and other volumes based on, how I continue to progress and what I hear back. So keeping in mind that, all of it is offerings, unconditional offerings, and how it works for you or how it shifts for you is just as interesting to me. Because it can be a gift back. And from that place of community, from that place of being one of the grief guys, one of the people in the arena, like that is the intention of it. It wasn't to get grief right the first time I wrote a book, and to be like, this is it, guys,
No, that's not how it works. That's why
Yeah,
Brene keeps putting out more and more books,
exactly.
because it's not just one thing. There's
And
layers.
for example, it's like a formal invitation to, to play in the arena, because, from her book to now, because she's changed culture itself, the sociology of what she's teaching and what she's brought into the world has shifted. So, we've evolved with Brene. So it's like that same kind of thing where, I'm so interested in how, if we start the conversation this way, where it goes, much like in the men's mental health movement, and the gay men's mental health movement, honestly, like, there's a whole other, like, sector. And yeah, I just, what does support look like for you right now? That long-winded answer.
I just want to add, like, we've talked a lot about language and learning how to experience your feelings and emotions and language in regards to how it looked like in grief. And Brene's newest book, Atlas of the Heart, that literally is what it is. It is explaining, I think she has 86 different emotions, feelings, and it just kind of unpacks all of that to learn the language that you need to learn in order to express yourself correctly, so that people can understand it in a different way. Because if you say you're angry, that's different than saying, like, I'm disappointed, even though your anger is more of a cover for disappointment. So it's another great tool for learning the language aspect of it.
I actually, in my book, suggest for one of the experiments for them to read that book.
Oh,
I think
perfect.
like a manual on being, because we don't realize, and she brings up such a great point. Sorry, I'm such a nerd about this, and I know we're wrapping up, but like that out of all the people that she interviewed, that they identified 3 feelings: sad,
Yeah.
mad, and happy.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like, whoa, that's like really scary to like approach all of your humanity and like a deep grief process or a mental health challenge, like, with just that in your artillery belt, like there's so much more, and it's so empowering to learn what you're actually feeling and to be able to put names around it and to really start to differentiate. Like, in the book, I have like an emotion chart, and from mad, it goes into 28 other emotions of like all the things that can be, jealous, angry, there's so much there. And so I love that book. I also suggest it as a companion for when things come up, or to read that book, but read one emotion a day and
Hmm.
just let it sit and digest it. And
Yeah.
how does that fit into my life? I think that sometimes what gets missing in all of this is the lab. Like we all like to do lecture, we like to read, we like to take in information, we like to consciously consume. Okay, great, got it. And then when it comes to being in lab, like, like doctors have to actually then do surgeries and do procedures and like being watched and like,
Yeah.
the ranks up. I think like grief and mental health are exactly like that. It's like you have to put in the lab hours where
Oh,
you're
yeah.
applying what you've learned from Brene Brown to the first time you're truly triggered or truly challenged or
Yeah.
truly, that's sort of, which is beautiful that we're at a point where the majority are reading Brene. And then I think the next journey for us is like being willing to apply it,
The
and live it.
integration. I call it
Yeah,
the
the
integration of
integration. Yes,
what you're going through, because that's how I look at personal development. It's like, it's not like you're just constantly going up this hill, because like you can't process that much. You have to go up the hill, and then you have to kind of plateau and like integrate, and then maybe you'll drop down a bit and be like, this is too much, like like I just want to like just do whatever the fuck I want for a while, and then so you go down a little bit, and then you start going back up and go, okay, I need to check back in with myself. And like that's how it goes. It's an ebb and a flow, and it's hills. It's not, life is, we're both masterpieces and messes all at the same time, and you gotta integrate all of it, and learn to love all the aspects of it, and not just like these compartmentalized parts of it. you know um Today has been incredibly enlightening. It's been fantastic. You speak so eloquently about your experience, and you tie everything together so well. I think that our listeners are going to get a lot out of this, and I really appreciate you and your time. Um, I just want to find out, where can people know more about you, your handles, where they can get your book. We're going to have a lot of these in the show notes, but let everybody know where they can find out more information.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an honor to be here. And I'm glad you thought I was eloquent at 7 a.m. on Australian time. I'll
Yeah.
take it. I will accept that. I'm Addison Brasil, Brazil like the country, but spelled with an S, on Instagram and the normal things, and that the normal things.
The
And then,
socials.
God, this call to action needs work. But then mygriefclub.com is the place for the grief stuff, the book is available on Amazon worldwide. I'm so grateful that it's, slowly becoming a bestseller and people are finding it. And please, 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 like I said, if you do pick it up and you do start experimenting in your grief, please reach out. That my email's in the book. I started a text service through there. I really, really am excited about the collaborative part of what comes from this. Yeah, I'm accessible. With boundaries, of course, but I am accessible. And also, a disclaimer that there are many, many people. I get messages almost every other day now of men using my pictures and scamming people on the internet. So if it's not me, if it's not Addison Brasil, it's not me. So if anybody is, I speak a lot about mental health and a lot about grief. So there's a vulnerability to capitalize on there. And so it's so weird that I feel the need to start saying this, but please make sure it is me. We live in a different world, and you should, the safe space I've created, I want you to make sure you're in that
Yeah.
safe space.
We'll make
Whenever.
sure I link up the correct one. So don't worry, we got that there. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you so much for listening to Gay Men Going Deeper. If you like what you've heard, please go over to Apple iTunes, give us a 5-star, leave us a review. We love reading those. You can also give us a star rating on, I think, Spotify now, which is really great. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell because it'll notify you every time new episodes come out, which is going to be every Thursday, and stay up to date on all the things that we are putting out. And if you're not a member in the Gay Men's Brotherhood on Facebook, go and check us out. That'll also be in the show notes for you to join our community. I think we're getting almost at 5,000 members now. So come and join in the conversation. It's a safe space to kind of have discussions like we have every day that we do on this podcast. So thank you so much for listening. And Addison, thank you so much for joining us today.